My father did not ask me, he told me. I was standing in the Grand Council chamber when he said it, surrounded by 50 of the highest lords and ministers of the Aethoran Empire, the golden light of Aethor Prime pouring through the arched crystal windows like it had no idea what had just happened. My father, Emperor Valethar, sat on the high throne with his silver robes arranged perfectly around him, his expression calm, his voice even, the way it always was when he had already decided something and was simply informing the rest of the universe. He said that the Concord of Stars would be sealed. He said that the Terran Federation had agreed to every major term. He said that the human delegation had shown, in his words, remarkable good faith. And then he said that in the tradition of great alliances, the agreement would be honored with a union, a marriage, between the Crown Princess of the Aethoran Empire and a representative of the Terran Federation. I heard my own heartbeat for 3 full seconds before I heard anything else. The representative they had chosen was not a prince. There were no human princes, which I already knew, and had always considered a reflection of their limited civilization. He was not a diplomat or a senator, or even one of their generals. He was a soldier, a sergeant, by rank. His name was Elias Kale, and according to the thin file that was placed in my hands the following morning, he was 31 years old, born on a rim mining colony called Vardis III, decorated 3 times for service during the Caridon border conflict, and currently assigned to no active unit. I read the file twice. Then I set it on my writing table and looked out the window at the city below, at the white towers and the river, and the thousands of my people going about their mourning, none of them aware that their princess had just been handed to a stranger. I did not raise my voice. I had learned long ago that raising one's voice in the Aethoran court was a sign of weakness. Instead, I walked to my private chamber, closed the door behind me, and stood very still until my handmaiden Saya appeared from the adjoining room and looked at my face and immediately understood that something was terribly wrong. "They have arranged my marriage," I said. Saya's large silver eyes went wide. "To whom?" "A human soldier." She said nothing for a moment. Then carefully, "Are you well, Your Highness?" "No," I said, "but I will be." I spent the rest of that day learning everything I could about Elias Kale. The Imperial Archives had very little. The Terran public records were more useful once my personal secretary decoded their filing system. What I found did not comfort me. He was not famous by human standards. He was not wealthy. He came from a world so far out on the edge of Terran space that most of their own people had never heard of it. Vardis III was a rock covered in extraction equipment and dust, populated by laborers and their families, unremarkable by any measure. What he had done during the Caridon conflict was harder to find details on. The human military kept their operational records sealed for 50 years. What I could access were the public citations, written in their flat, understated military language. Words like exceptional valor under sustained enemy fire and decisive action that preserved the lives of Allied personnel. I read them 3 times and still could not picture the man they described. Valor was easy to write. It was harder to earn. What truly unsettled me was the letter. When the formal confirmation of the treaty was delivered to the palace the following afternoon, there was a secondary document tucked inside the diplomatic envelope. It was not typed. It was handwritten, in Aethoran script, clearly practiced but imperfect, the letters a little large and unevenly spaced, like someone who had learned them recently and was trying very hard. It read, "Your Highness, I understand this is not what either of us would have chosen. I want you to know that I intend to approach this situation with honesty and respect, and that I will not pretend to be something I am not. I hope, in time, that we can find a way to speak honestly with each other. Elias Kale." I read it 4 times. Then I handed it to Saya without a word. She read it and looked up at me. "He learned to write in Aethoran. Apparently, that takes months." "Yes," I said. "It does." I did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was this: no diplomat had ever written to me in Aethoran. The ambassadors and ministers who visited our court always brought their own translators, always spoke through intermediaries, always kept a careful distance that allowed them to claim they had not said what they had clearly said. This man had sat somewhere, alone with a language guide and a pen, and written to me in my own language, badly, carefully, without pretending it was easy. It was the most unsettling thing in the entire file. He arrived on a Thursday morning. I know because I was at the east window of my chamber when the shuttle descended through the cloud cover, a small Terran vessel, nothing like the grand diplomatic transports that usually brought foreign dignitaries. It landed in the lower courtyard rather than the ceremonial one. I watched through a viewport as the landing ramp extended. One person walked down it. Just one. No attendants, no bodyguards, no delegation. He carried a single bag over one shoulder, dark fabric, well-worn, the kind of bag that had been to difficult places and showed it. He wore a plain, dark formal jacket, clearly Terran in cut, neat but not extravagant. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked up at the palace. Not at me. He could not have known I was watching. He just looked at the building the way a person looks at something large that they are trying to understand. Then he adjusted the strap of his bag and walked toward the entrance where the palace attendants were waiting. I stepped back from the window. My heart was doing something I did not appreciate. Saya appeared at my shoulder.
He came alone,
she said quietly. I noticed. The Terran ambassador mentioned there would be an escort of 6. He did not bring one. She considered this. Either he was told not to, or he chose not to. Given what I know of human military culture, I said, I suspect he chose. I turned away from the window and made myself sit at my reading table. I had duties. I had a morning correspondence to review and a session with the Council on Agricultural Policy in the outer districts. I was a crown princess of the Athoran Empire. I had been managing complex affairs of state since I was 14 years old. I could not read a single word of the correspondence. My eyes moved across the text and understood none of it. The formal introduction was arranged for the 3rd bell of the afternoon. I wore the silver ceremonial gown with the high collar, which I had always found uncomfortable, but which projected exactly the right degree of formal authority. I wore my hair in the traditional court arrangement, pinned with the 3 silver clasps that indicated my rank. I was, by any measure, ready. He was shown into the formal reception hall, where I stood with 6 of my senior attendants arranged around me. He walked in, and I watched him take in the room. His eyes moved across it methodically, from the high ceiling to the floor to the walls, to the attendants to me. It was not the wide-eyed gaze of someone impressed by grandeur. It was the careful assessment of someone who was counting exits and reading the room. A soldier's habit. He stopped the appropriate distance away and gave a short, formal bow. Not deep, not servile, not the sweeping gesture that foreign visitors usually offered. A respectful inclination of the head. Then he straightened and looked directly at me with calm gray eyes and said, in accented but clear Athoran, Your Highness, I imagine this is difficult. It is for me too. The room was very quiet. I had prepared 3 different opening statements depending on what he said first. None of them applied. I had expected something formal, something practiced, something diplomatic. The simple honesty of what he actually said cut directly through every one of my preparations. I chose the most neutral response I had available. Welcome to Athor Prime, Sergeant Kale. I trust your journey was comfortable. He looked at me for a moment. It was fine, thank you. His Athoran, I noticed, was better than the letter had suggested. The accent was strong, the vowels slightly wrong, but the grammar was careful, and he clearly understood everything I said without delay. He had been studying, continuously, right up until, and probably during, the journey here. I could not decide if that was admirable or irritating. I settled on both. After the formal introduction was concluded, and he had been shown to his guest quarters, I returned to my own chamber and stood at the window for a long time. The city glittered below in the late afternoon light. Somewhere in this palace, a human soldier was unpacking a single worn bag into rooms that could have held an entire Terran apartment. Saya brought me tea and sat near the window without being asked. She was good at knowing when I needed company without conversation. After a while, I said, he did not try to impress me. No, she agreed. He did not. Every diplomat, every suitor, every foreign visitor who has ever stood in that hall has tried to impress me. It is the first thing they do. They say something grand, or they offer something expensive, or they dress in their most elaborate formal wear. He wore a plain jacket and told me it was difficult. Saya held her tea with both hands. Is that bad? I thought about it for a longer time than the question probably deserved. "I have no idea," I said finally, and that was the truest thing I had said all day. Over the following days, I watched him, not openly, from corridors, through attendance reports, from windows. It was, I told myself, strategic intelligence. Knowing one's circumstances meant knowing all the elements within them. He was an element. I was simply being thorough. He woke before dawn every morning and trained in the lower courtyard, not with weapons, just his own body, a disciplined sequence of movements that went on for an hour without pause. Rain did not stop him. Cold did not stop him. He was simply out there, in the gray pre-dawn light, working with the quiet consistency of a person who has been doing this long enough that it no longer requires motivation. He spent his afternoons in the palace library. I had the librarian's assistant, a young man named Corvin, report back to me. According to Corvin, the human was reading everything he could find on Athoran governance structure, historical relations between their two peoples, and the agricultural economics of the outer districts. He asked thoughtful questions. He took notes in a small paper notebook with a plain writing implement that he carried in his front pocket. He ate in the guest dining hall with 2 junior attendants assigned to him, spoke to them politely, and asked them questions about themselves rather than talking about himself. By the 3rd day, both attendants had, according to the palace household manager, voluntarily extended their duty hours to continue serving him. I found this deeply suspicious. On the 5th day, I encountered him unexpectedly in the East Garden. I had gone there after a particularly long council session to be alone with the night-blooming silver flowers, which were the one thing in the palace that reliably made me feel peaceful. He was already there, sitting on the stone bench near the center fountain, reading his small notebook in the dim garden light. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the gravel. He immediately moved to stand. I waved a hand before he could rise fully. "Sit," I said. "I came here to avoid ceremony, not to create more of it." He settled back and closed his notebook. "I can leave, if you prefer to be alone." I did not say that either. I sat on the bench at the other end, maintaining a correct distance, and looked at the silver flowers. They were opening slowly in the evening air, their petals catching what little light remained. We sat without speaking for several minutes. It was not uncomfortable. That surprised me. Eventually, I said, "You are learning the agricultural policy documents." He glanced over. A brief expression crossed his face, that I was beginning to associate with him, registering mild surprise at something he had not expected me to know. "I am," he said. "The outer district water allocation system seems like it might be a source of tension. I wanted to understand it." "It is a source of tension. It has been for 60 years. Why has it not been resolved?" I looked at him. He asked it simply, without guile, the way a person asks when they actually want to know, rather than when they are making a point. "Because the families who benefit from the current system have held positions on the Resource Council for 3 generations, I said. "Changing the system means moving against entrenched interests, and no one has yet decided the conflict is worth the cost." He nodded slowly. "And you?" "I think it is worth the cost," I said. "I have not yet convinced enough of the council to agree." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the flowers. Then, "What would it take?" I started to give him a summary of the political landscape and stopped. Because he had leaned slightly forward, his elbows on his knees, his notebook set aside, and he was listening with the specific quality of attention that means the person actually intends to remember what you say. I gave him the full answer. He asked 2 follow-up questions that were better than most questions my own council members asked. By the time I stood to leave, the garden was full dark, and the silver flowers were fully open. I paused on the gravel path and looked back at him, still sitting with his notebook open again, writing something. I did not say goodnight. Athoran court protocol did not require it in an informal garden encounter. But I noticed, as I walked back toward the palace lights, that the silence between us had not once felt like a silence that needed to be filled. That was new. In my experience, every man who had ever sat near me had eventually felt compelled to fill every silence with something, usually something about himself. Elias Kale had told me nothing about himself, and asked me 3 questions that made me think. I did not sleep well that night. I told myself it was because of the council session. I was not particularly convinced. The formal announcement of the engagement was made to the full court the following week. I stood at my father's right hand and held my expression in the practiced stillness of 17 years of royal appearances, and I watched the assembled lords and ministers and ambassadors react to the news. Most of them were careful. A few were visibly displeased. 1. The lord of the Vitharis district, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Durath, allowed himself a small, contemptuous smile in the direction of where Elias Kale was standing to one side of the chamber. I noticed Kale notice it. His expression did not change. 2 days later, at a formal reception hosted in honor of the treaty, Durath made his contempt public. He stood near enough to Kale to be clearly addressing him, and said to the man beside him, loudly enough to be heard by a dozen people, "I understand they could not find a real representative. A pet soldier will have to do." The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Every eye moved to Kale. I was across the room and I went still completely. Kale turned his head slowly and looked at Durath. He did not look angry. He looked at the man the way a person looks at something they are simply assessing. Then he said, in clear Aetheran, at a volume the room could hear, "I have been called worse by people I respected." He turned back to the conversation he had been having with a junior minister, as if nothing had happened. Durath went very red. He did not speak again for the rest of the evening. The story was through the entire palace by midnight. By the next morning, 3 different people had repeated it to me as though I had not been present. I received it each time with a neutral expression and said nothing. What I was thinking was this. In 17 years of formal court life, I had never once seen a man absorb a public insult and turn it into a statement of quiet dignity, so complete that the person who delivered the insult ended up looking smaller for having tried. Aethoran nobles traded insults like currency. They responded with counterattacks, with elaborate shows of indifference, with political retaliation. They performed their dignity rather than simply possessing it. That evening, I found him in the garden again. He was not reading. He was sitting with his face turned up slightly, looking at the sky, at the stars visible between the cloud breaks. It was a habit. I was learning. He looked at the sky often. I sat on the far bench again. After a while, without looking away from the sky, he said, "I grew up on a colony where you could see 7,000 stars on a clear night. No light pollution. Nothing between you and all of it." He paused. "Here, the city lights wash most of them out." "You miss it," I said. "Sometimes." Then, after a moment, "Not the way I used to. I think I was angrier then." I did not ask what he meant, but I thought about it for a long time after I went inside. I was not, I realized, as certain as I had been a week ago about what I thought of him. I had arrived at the beginning of this situation with a clear idea of what he was. That idea was becoming harder to hold on to, and I was not yet sure whether I should fight to keep it or set it down and look at what was underneath it. What I knew was this. For the first time in a very long time, I was genuinely uncertain about something. And for a princess of the Aethoran Empire who had been trained to be certain about everything, that feeling was both deeply uncomfortable and, against all my expectations, a little like relief. The state tour of the outer provinces was announced the following week, and my father made it clear, in the politely immovable way that my father made most things clear, that Sergeant Kale would accompany the delegation. I accepted this without visible objection. I was getting better at accepting things without visible objection. It was becoming necessary. The delegation consisted of myself, 4 senior ministers, Saya, and my 2 other personal attendants, a household staff of 11, 2 palace physicians, a communications officer, and 3 of the imperial ceremonial guards. It was a modest delegation by Aethoran standards. We traveled aboard the state transport, a mid-sized vessel with formal reception rooms at the front and more practical quarters toward the rear. Kale was given quarters near the rear, close to the communications room. I suspected this was an administrative accident rather than any particular plan, but I noticed that he immediately introduced himself to the communications officer and spent an hour with her on the first day learning the systems. By the second day, they were having breakfast together. His name, I was learning from palace reports, appeared regularly in positive contexts. Attendants mentioned him. Staff mentioned him. He remembered names. He asked follow-up questions to previous conversations. He thanked people for things they had done 2 days prior, which suggested he was paying enough attention to register what people had done 2 days prior. It was irritating. It was also, I had to admit to myself in the quiet of my own mind, genuinely unusual. I was surrounded, every day of my life, by people who managed impressions. They remembered names when it was useful. They thanked people when the thanks would be noticed. What Kale appeared to do was simply pay attention, without calculation, without an audience. There was no one watching him be thoughtful to the communications officer at breakfast. He was just being thoughtful. I spent more of the first day than I intended thinking about this. Then I made myself stop and reviewed the provincial briefing documents instead. On the third evening of the tour, we were descending toward Vitharan province, the southernmost and most difficult of the outer districts, when the atmospheric processor at the provincial hub failed. I learned this from a sudden shift in the transport's environmental systems, followed by the calm but urgent voice of the pilot reporting reduced heat generation capability and recommending emergency landing protocols. The temperature outside was 43 degrees below the Athoran comfort threshold. The transport was equipped for standard atmospheric conditions, not for an extended cold weather hold. We had, by the pilot's calculation, enough onboard thermal reserves for approximately 4 hours before the interior temperature would drop to dangerous levels for my people. The provincial landing site had a secondary structure, an older administrative building, partially heated, with enough structural integrity to shelter the delegation. The problem was that it had been used as storage for the past 12 years, and no one was certain of its current condition, or whether its heating systems were operational. I was standing at the front of the delegation when all of this was being explained, watching my 4 senior ministers respond in exactly the way senior ministers respond to sudden emergencies, which is to say they began very quickly talking about who was responsible for the maintenance failures and what the protocol review process should look like. Kale was not in the front of the delegation. He had already gone to the rear. By the time I turned to look, he had found the transport's emergency kit, pulled out the thermal mapping equipment, and was already reading the external environment data. He looked up and found Corvin, the household manager in the group. "How many people total?" he asked. 34, Corvin said immediately. "Heat packs in the emergency kit, 30 of them. Not enough to run continuously. We rotate them in groups of 8, 2 packs per group, 40 minutes per rotation. That stretches the supply by about 6 hours. Have someone start counting the packs and logging them." He turned to the pilot. "The secondary structure. Distance from the landing point?" "Approximately 300 meters. Surface conditions?" "Hard packed. Should be walkable." He nodded. "We go in 2 groups, attendants and staff in the first group, ministerial personnel, and the princess in the second. First group carries the non-essential supply cases and begins assessing the secondary structure immediately. If the heating system is non-functional, we need to know in the next 40 minutes, not the next 2 hours. Someone with mechanical experience needs to be in the first group." One of the household staff, a quiet woman named Petra, who had worked palace maintenance before joining the traveling household, raised her hand. "Good," Kale said. "You lead that group. Report back the moment you have a heating assessment." Petra nodded with a confidence I had not seen her display before. "Your Highness," Kale said, turning to me with a short nod. "The second group will be ready in about 12 minutes. I would recommend staying mobile rather than waiting in the transport. Movement helps maintain core temperature." I looked at him for a moment. He was not asking permission. He was not deferring or performing. He had looked at the situation, made a plan, and was executing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing before, in worse conditions, with fewer resources. Every one of my ministers was still in a conversation about responsibility protocols. 12 minutes, I said. All right. He had already moved on to the next thing. Within those 12 minutes, 34 people were organized, briefed, equipped, and moving. Petra's report came back in 15 minutes. The heating system in the secondary structure was functional, but running at reduced capacity. Kale immediately adjusted the rotation plan, calculated which rooms would hold warmth the best, based on Petra's description of the building layout, and had everyone assigned to specific spaces before the second group arrived. We spent 9 hours in that building. By the end, The heat was stable, everyone was adequately warm, and the emergency repair team sent by the provincial authority had arrived with the parts needed to restore the transport systems. Nobody had panicked. Nobody had gotten hurt. The ministerial debates about responsibility protocols had been, very gently, redirected by Kale into more productive conversations about what everyone needed and how to make the next few hours more comfortable. I watched him, during those 9 hours, more than I watched anything else. Not because there was nothing else to watch, because I could not stop. He did not sit with the ministers. He moved through the space, checking in with different people, making sure the heat rotation was working, talking to the attendants and staff with the same easy attention he gave to everyone. At one point, he was in the corner helping one of the younger attendants, a girl of about 17 named Ren, work through a breathing exercise for her anxiety. He had clearly noticed that she was frightened and had quietly gone to sit beside her without making any announcement of it. I saw that and felt something shift in my chest, something I did not have a name for and did not try to find one. We ate cold rations in the main room around the 3rd hour, all 34 of us together, which was not how things usually worked in a delegation where status determined everything from seating to serving order. It simply was not possible to maintain those distinctions in a room this size with a functioning heater taking up one corner and everyone wearing blankets. I sat on a supply case. One of my ministers sat on the floor. Kale sat cross-legged near the door with a heat pack balanced on his knee and his notebook open. I moved to sit near him. There was more space there and I told myself that was the only reason. After a while I said, "Why did you agree to this?" He did not ask which this. He knew. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because someone had to, and I figured if I hated it, I had already been in worse situations." "That is not a reason," I said. "That is the absence of a reason." He looked at me then. In the low light of the emergency lamps, his gray eyes were dark. "The honest answer is that I have been between assignments for 8 months. I have been living in a small apartment on Vardis 3, and thinking about the Keratin conflict more than is probably healthy. Someone came to me with a reason to go somewhere and be useful. I said yes. I waited." He looked back at his notebook. "I did not expect to find it interesting." "And do you?" I asked. "Find it interesting?" He considered the question with the particular seriousness he brought to questions that deserved it. "Yes," he said, "more than I expected." I did not ask him to clarify what he meant. I was not certain I needed to, and I was not certain I was ready for the answer if I was wrong about what it meant. Instead, I said, "Tell me about the Keratin conflict." He was still for a moment. Then he told me, not at length, not in the way that men sometimes speak of their own difficult histories, expanding and dramatizing and watching for the listener's reaction. He spoke the way a person speaks about something they have thought about so many times that the words are worn smooth. He told me the facts: 300 soldiers, a defensive line, 40 survivors. He had made the call to hold. He did not say he was right to hold it. He did not say he was wrong. He just said he had made the call, and 40 people had come home, and he had thought about the others every day for 4 years. The room was quiet around us. Some people had fallen asleep. Others were in low conversations of their own. I said, "How do humans carry that kind of weight?" He thought about it the way he thought about things that deserved real consideration. "I am not sure we do carry it," he said. "Not exactly. We just keep moving. We put one foot in front of the other because stopping means the weight becomes the only thing that exists. Moving means there is also the next thing, and the next thing after that." He paused. "It is maybe the only thing we are genuinely good at." I looked at him in the low light of that cold room in that old building in the southernmost province of my empire. I thought about everything I had believed about his people before he arrived. I thought about the words I had used, in my own mind, before I had ever seen his face. Brutal, short-lived, limited. I thought about how comfortable those words had been, and how completely they had failed to account for the man sitting cross-legged, 3 feet away from me, carrying 4 years of grief, with the quiet persistence of someone who had decided that stopping was not an option. "I think that might be the most important thing anyone can be good at," I said. He looked at me for a moment, then he looked back at his notebook, but I saw, at the corner of his mouth, the beginning of something that I was learning to recognize as the closest thing he had to a full smile. We did not speak again for a long time, but the silence, as it had been from the beginning, was not empty. It was full of things that neither of us had said yet, and both of us were thinking. By the time the repair team arrived, and the transport was restored, something had changed between us that I could not have pointed to directly. It was not dramatic. There was no moment I could have named. It was simply that when we boarded the transport again for the return leg of the tour, I chose a seat that was closer to the rear, and when Cale sat down 2 seats away and opened his notebook, I did not feel the need to pretend I was somewhere else. That was, I decided, a beginning. The notice from the Purist Assembly arrived on a Tuesday. It was addressed to the Grand Council and copied to my father and, as a formal courtesy, to me. It was 6 pages of carefully constructed political language that said, in essence, one thing. The Assembly intended to move for a formal review of the Concord of Stars, citing what they called cultural incompatibility and the risk of imperial dignity being compromised by an inappropriate union. I read it at my writing table in the morning, before Saya had come in with tea, before the day had properly started. I read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and then I set it on the table and looked at the window for a long time. The Purist Assembly was not a small faction. They held 11 seats on the Grand Council, which was not enough to block a majority, but was enough to cause significant political damage if they chose to. Their leader, a woman named Velath, was 70 years old and had been in the council longer than I had been alive. She was not a fool. She would not have sent this notice unless she believed she had the support to make it a serious challenge. I sent for my political secretary and spent 2 hours going through the council mathematics. The numbers were not comfortable. The Concord of Stars had passed with a 14-seat majority. 3 of those seats belonged to lords who had expressed private reservations. If the Assembly managed to move those 3, the majority dissolved. I did not tell Cale about the notice immediately. I told myself this was because there was nothing to be done until the situation developed further and I had more information. That was true. It was also true that I did not want to have the conversation yet. He found out anyway. Of course he did. He was careful and attentive, and the palace was not a sealed system. One of the attendants mentioned something, or a minister spoke too freely in a corridor, or he simply read the political mood of the palace, the way a soldier reads terrain. He came to the East Garden at the time I was usually there, which was either coincidence or intention, and I had stopped assuming things were coincidence where he was concerned. He sat on the far bench and did not open his notebook. After a while, he said, "I heard about the Assembly's notice." "Yes," I said. "I want you to know that whatever decision you need to make, it should be what you actually believe is right, not what you think is expected of you, and not on my account." I looked at him. That is easy to say. I mean it. I did not come here to be anyone's political problem. If the honest resolution to this situation is a different one than the one we are currently in, I can accept that. I was quiet for a moment. You are telling me you would accept the dissolution of the treaty. I am telling you that I would rather you make a choice you believe in than one you feel you have no option but to make. There is a difference. And your own preference? I asked. Your own position? He looked at the silver flowers, which were closed in the daylight, tight pale buds waiting for the evening. My preference is the one I have had since I arrived, he said. But preferences are not decisions, and decisions belong to the people who have to live with them. I looked at him for a long time. He did not look back. He was giving me the space to think, which was what he always did, which was one of the things about him that I had never expected, and had not found a way to stop appreciating. I said, "What happened on the night before the Caridin siege?" He went still for a moment, then quietly, "Why do you ask?" "Because the Assembly is going to use it. They have already sourced footage. They are building a version of you that I need to understand before they present it to the full council." A long pause. He was choosing what to tell me and how much. I could see him doing it. "The night before," he said, "I was given information that changed our tactical situation. We had been positioned to hold a secondary line while the main force withdrew. The information told us the withdrawal had been delayed. If we fell back to our secondary position on schedule, the main force would be exposed. If we held the primary line for an additional 8 hours, the withdrawal could complete successfully." He stopped. "And you held," I said. We held, and 260 people did not come home. No, he said, they did not. Was the decision right? He was quiet for so long that I thought, again, that he would not answer. Then, the main force survived. 4,700 soldiers made it out because that line held. Whether the decision was right depends on how you count. He paused. I have never found a way of counting that makes it feel right. I have found ways of counting that make it make sense. That is as far as I have gotten. I sat with that for a while. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a city bird was calling from a rooftop. The assembly will make you a butcher, I said. They will show the footage and call it evidence of human disregard for life. I know. Does that frighten you? He thought about it. What frightens me, he said slowly, is the idea that someone might believe it who knew enough to know better. He did not look at me as he said it. He kept his eyes on the flowers. Someone with the full information, who chose to call it brutality anyway. That would be difficult. I understood what he was saying. He was not asking me for anything. He was not appealing or requesting. He was simply telling me the truth about what would hurt, because I had asked, and he answered honestly when asked, and he trusted me enough to keep doing it. That trust, I realized, had been building quietly this whole time, in gardens and corridors and a cold building in the outer provinces, in small notebooks and morning training and conversations about agricultural policy, and 8 hours in a failing atmospheric shelter. He had been honest with me, consistently, at his own expense, from the very first written letter in imperfect Athoran, and I had not been honest with him, not fully, not about the things that mattered. The following 3 days were the worst of the political crisis. The assembly released their material to the council's private communications channel, which meant within 24 hours it had moved through the entire palace and most of the connected ministries. The footage was real but was shown without context. The written account of the siege was accurate in its facts and entirely misleading in its framing. The conclusion the assembly drew was presented as inevitable when it was anything but. 3 lords sent me private messages indicating they were reconsidering their positions. 2 senior ministers requested meetings with my father. The palace felt, for the first time in years, genuinely unstable. I asked for a meeting with Lord Durath, which surprised him enough that he agreed before he thought better of it. We sat in a formal meeting room, him on one side and me on the other, and I said, "You intend to support the Assembly's motion." "I have concerns," he said carefully. "You have been vocal in your contempt since Sergeant Kale arrived," I said. "That is different from having concerns. I want to know what you actually believe." He studied me. "I believe the Empire made a mistake. Based on what evidence? Based on principle. This union is beneath the dignity of the crown." "Beneath it how?" I asked. "In what specific way does a man who organized 34 people through a cold weather emergency, who speaks our language because he chose to learn it, who has been honest in every exchange he has had in this palace, fall short of whatever standard you are applying?" Durath's expression shifted very slightly. "He is a soldier, Your Highness. So are a third of our own noble families, by lineage. The Varath family held their seat for 200 years on the basis of military service. Lord Varath's ancestor held a siege line for 6 days against superior numbers, and we made him a provincial governor. Tell me what the difference is." He did not have an answer. He had an instinct, not a reason. I had known that before I walked into the room. I wanted him to know that I knew it. When I left the meeting, Saya was waiting in the corridor. She fell into step beside me, and we walked without speaking for a moment. Then she said quietly, "The council vote has been confirmed, 3 days from now." "Yes," I said. "What are you going to do?" I had been asking myself that for 72 hours. I had written 3 different speeches and discarded all of them. I had made lists of political arguments and weighed them against each other until the weights stopped meaning anything. I had done everything I knew how to do, as a politician, and a diplomat, and a princess. None of it felt like enough. None of it felt like the truth. "I am going to speak," I said, just not the way I had planned. The Grand Council chamber held 200 people at full session. On the day of the vote, it was at capacity. The formal galleries were open and filled with observers. The proceedings were broadcast on the Imperial Communications Network to every connected system in the Concord. I had not slept particularly well. I had the speech in my hand, the careful, measured, politically constructed one, as I walked to the podium. I felt the weight of every eye in the room. I felt the weight of every calculation I had made, and every argument I had prepared. I put the speech on the podium and looked at it. It was good. It was accurate. It covered every necessary point and addressed the Assembly's arguments, and would, by my best estimate, move 2 of the 3 wavering lords back to the treaty's side. It was exactly what a skilled political address was supposed to be. I set it aside. The chamber was very quiet. I was afraid of him, I said. No opening formality. No title sequence. Just those words, into the silence. I want to be honest about that, because I believe most of you were afraid too. Some of you still are. I understand that. I am going to try to explain what changed. I saw, in my peripheral vision, my father's expression shift very slightly on the high seat. Not displeasure, something more careful than that. When my father announced this arrangement, I was given a file with the basic facts of Sergeant Cale's life and service. It told me his age, his colony of origin, his rank, his decorations. It did not tell me the things I have learned since. I am going to tell you some of them now, not as political arguments, because you have heard the political arguments, but as simple facts about a person I have come to know. I told them about the letter, the handwritten Athoran, practiced and imperfect, that had reached me before he did. I told them about the state tour, about the atmospheric failure, about how 34 people had been organized and kept safe in a crisis by a man who had asked for nothing in return, and took no credit afterward. I told them about the garden conversations, about the agricultural policy questions, about what he had told me of the Caridon siege in the plain, worn smooth words of someone who had thought about it every day for 4 years. I told them what I had actually seen, not what the Assembly's account claimed. The Assembly has presented you with a version of this man, built from selected facts and removed context, I said. I have no doubt those facts are real. The Caridon engagement happened. 260 people did not come home. That is real, and it is heavy, and I am not asking you to set it aside. I paused. I am asking you to also consider what the full picture contains. 4,700 soldiers who made it out because a line held. A man who chose to take on this assignment not for personal benefit, but because he thought he could be useful, and has demonstrated that usefulness every single day since he arrived. A person who told me, the first time we spoke, that this was difficult, because it was true, and because he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I looked at the full chamber. I looked at the Assembly's section, at the measured expressions of people who had decided something, and were waiting to see if it would survive. I was afraid of what he represented, I said. I was afraid of the unfamiliar. I told myself that fear was wisdom, that it was appropriate caution, that it was the natural response of a people protecting their own culture. I have spent the past weeks learning that it was simply fear, wearing wisdom's clothes. I let that sit for a moment. Wisdom asks questions. Fear makes decisions before the questions can be asked. I should have asked questions sooner. I am glad I asked them when I did. The chamber was completely still. I support the Concord of Stars, I said. Not because my father signed it, not because the political mathematics require it, because I have seen what it produced, and I believe it is right, and I believe the person standing at the center of it is a man of more genuine integrity than most of this chamber has encountered in years. I straightened. That is all I have to say. I stepped back from the podium. The silence lasted 3 more seconds. Then the chamber began to move. The vote, when it came, was not the clean majority I had hoped for. It was close. 11 in favor of the Assembly's motion, 19 against, with 4 abstentions. The Concord held. The motion for review was defeated. 3 members of the Purist Assembly announced that afternoon they would be resigning their council seats. 2 lords who had been wavering sent me private notes before the session officially closed. One said simply, "Well argued." The other, the older of the 2, said, "I had not considered the letter." I sat in my private chamber afterward, with Saya across from me, and tea going cold on the table between us, and I did not feel victorious. I felt something quieter than that. Something more like the sensation of having finally said a true thing out loud after a long time of almost saying it. He found me in the garden that evening. The The silver flowers were fully open in the dark, white petals catching the light from the palace windows. He walked slowly across the gravel and sat on the near bench, closer than his usual distance, and for a while neither of us said anything. Then he said, quietly, "You did not have to say all of that." "No," I said. "I wanted to." Another silence. The city hummed its distant hum. The flowers held their small light. "So," he said, and I heard in his voice the particular quality that I had come to know as him choosing carefully, deciding to be lighter on purpose. "What happens now?" I looked at him. I looked at this man who had arrived alone with a worn bag and a handwritten letter, and had been, since that moment, consistently and quietly himself in a place that rewarded performance over substance. I thought about what it had cost him to be that, and how he had never once asked for acknowledgement of the cost. "I suppose," I said, "we find out." He looked at me for a moment. Then that small, quiet expression appeared at the corner of his mouth, the one that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing he had, and it was, I had decided, one of the best things I had ever seen. The fear had not left entirely. I did not think it would. Not immediately, not all at once. But it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of a stranger, of something unknown and therefore threatening. It was a different kind of fear, the kind that accompanies anything worth having, the kind that is really just hope with honest expectations. I had learned something about humans in these weeks. They move forward, not because the fear goes away, not because the past gets lighter, but because they decide, every morning, that the next thing is worth finding out. I thought I was beginning to understand the language of that. I thought I was beginning, slowly, carefully, with both eyes open, to speak it. The garden was very quiet. The flowers were very bright. Elias Kale was reading his notebook again, the small worn one with the careful notes in 2 languages, and I was sitting closer than I had the first night, and neither of us mentioned it. It was, I decided, a good place to start.